Riga Conference podcast brought to you by Latvian Transatlantic Organization.
Hello, everyone. Today, on behalf of the Latvian Transatlantic Organization, I have the pleasure to invite you to a very interesting debate on Russia with a well-known Deutsche Welle journalist on all things Russian and freelance journalist, Honorable Konstantin Egger. Since the unprovoked war that started on February 24, we all knew Putin's intentions was to acquire a very quick victory in Ukraine with a fast government change. Now, almost a year into the conflict, we can see that Zelensky's government still stands, that the Russian intention has not come true. Conversely, the Ukrainian society has reinvented itself, its resilience and effort to stand against the Russian aggression. And I would say numeric Russian military superiority is inspiring many in Central Eastern Europe and awakening different kind of historical memories in our part, in Central Eastern Europe, in our part of Europe, since I'm also representing one of the Baltic citizens and European citizens here. But we have to ask those questions. Russia is nowhere gone. There have been questions about Russia splitting into parts, about social revolts and uprising inside of Russia, and very importantly, about its military leadership and political leadership changing its strategies, trying to adjust to this novel situation for them, since the foreign and security objectives did materialize in February of 2022. Now it's January to 2023, and I think it's a very good time for assessing Russia's international intentions, domestic adjustments to those realities, and what the leadership is thinking inside of the Kremlin and military headquarters. And I couldn't think of better expert than Honorable Konstantin Egger, the freelance journalist from Deutsche Welle, as I mentioned before. I will not hesitate to give the floor to Konstantin to explain those important traits for the Baltic states, for Ukraine, and also Central Eastern European allies. Konstantin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sandis. It's a great opportunity for me to address the public in the Baltic states and probably in a wider audience. So thanks for this opportunity. And I think that one important lesson of this year, nearly a year since the full-scale aggression of Russia against Ukraine began, is that the Russian Federation has certain reserve of economic and, what's even more important, social resilience to sanctions, to international pressure, and actually to a war that's not being prosecuted successfully. So actually what we need to understand first and foremost of all, although this war is a disastrous war for Putin indeed, it doesn't mean that Putin regime will be replaced tomorrow or even the day after tomorrow, historically speaking. Why we may talk a bit later, but I think that this is important because it gives us perspective. Every time we see, let us say, some kind of Russian defeat, let us say in Kherson a few weeks or months ago, Western analysts say, well, this is the beginning of the end. Putin will have to roll back. He will have to understand he's not winning this war. Well, maybe even if he does, and here are some questions about, basically how he assesses the situation, he will not relent. And this is, I think, the second lesson of this year. No matter what the success or failure is on the battlefield, Russia will continue to push forward. In this respect, any debates, any discussions about the Russian strategy are actually, well, I wouldn't say meaningless, but essentially you could concentrate on something else. For example, on the volume of support Ukraine needs in terms of arms and economic support, rather than debating a thing that's, I think, very clear by now. Putin's goal is to destroy Ukraine. I don't think that putting some kind of puppet government in Kiev will be seen as a realistic perspective today, even by the most hardline ideologues in Moscow. Well, probably by the most hardline and most delusional ideologues in Moscow, like Alexander Dugin. But I think that for the wider political class, for Putin's entourage, it must be clear by now, probably, putting some kind of Quisling on Bankova Street in Kiev is not on the order of the day. But what is definitely on the order of the day for the Kremlin is making Ukraine as little of a state and of a society as possible. That means scare, or rather terror tactics against civilians. That's why we see residential areas being hit, essentially, even where some meaningful hits on military infrastructure could be effectuated. What's even more important for Putin is to destroy what remains of Ukraine's infrastructure within the limits, within the reach of his weaponry. It will be more difficult for him to, destroy something in Odessa today than it is in Kharkiv or Dnipro or Kiev, for that matter, even Lviv. Now, a third lesson that needs to be taken on board when we assess the situation is that Putin does not care for casualties. He sees it in a very simple, sees this very simple equation. Ukraine now is probably, 30 plus million people. I mean, people that are within Ukraine. Russia is a 140 million country, probably 140 million plus. So the demographic advantage is absolutely clear. And what I think Putin, Gerasimov, Shoigu, and the rest of them are envisaging is actually throwing more and more and more people at Ukrainian defenses, no matter what the cost. And eventually, basically wearing Ukraine down, reaching a point when Ukraine, which cares about its people much more than the Russian government, will say, well, we just can't do it because we can't do it. There are not enough men to fight. And because of that, we will not see the end of these hostilities unless Ukraine manages to turn the tide decisively and liberate significant parts of the territory that not only was invaded and occupied in 2022, but maybe even parts of Donbass, and the ultimate prize, of course, is the Crimea. Until this defeat is absolutely clear, until the Russian government, the Russian military and political leadership stares this defeat in the face, they will not stop. And I suppose that this is a very hard thing to take on board, because we haven't seen such a protracted and wide-ranging conflict on the European continent since the Second World War. I mean, I covered a bit the Balkans wars of the 1990s as a journalist, and this is completely incomparable. So, although this is a hard thing to take on board, we have to take it on board. We have to understand it may last not only for 2023, but maybe 2024, and so on and so forth. So it sounds by now as if Putin is essentially victorious or potentially victorious. No, I don't think so. I think there are many factors that work inside Russia that gradually undermine this regime. But again, one needs to have patience. What is important is that, for example, the energy weapon against Europe didn't work Moreover, we can say it pretty much does not exist today, as Europe kind of reorients itself in terms of energy supplies, as it goes for the Green Revolution, no matter what opinion you have of it. It's clear that there's going to be less and less dependence on Russian energy, pretty much none. This, although, does not mean that Putin does not have other buyers. And frankly, here it will be very, very important to compare the situation to Iran, where sanctions lasted for years and years and years and years, and still the regime survived. Because, and the lesson is very simple, if you export oil, gas, and other commodities, you will always find buyers. You'll always find an India, a China, an African country, or whatever, Latin America, to buy your oil, your gas, your aluminum, or whatever. And even with discounts, Putin still will still have the money to maintain the army, his secret police, which is very important, and to throw a bone from time to time to the pensioners, to the students, to the kind of to what is called in Russian language budgetniki, those who depend on the state budget for survival. And if you look at 2024, then at least according to Russian official figures, the Russian state reserves grew during the year of war because of generally favorable energy conjecture on the world markets, and because, let's face it, Putin has a very professional financial and economic team that manage, especially the ones that are managing finance. So these technocrats are actually very important for this regime. But what I think works against Putin over time is essentially the fact that this war, just as Putin himself, gradually gets on people's nerves, not because of their particular love for Ukraine, not because they're particularly conscientious, but the way, let us say, Brezhnev started to get on everyone's nerves by the mid-1970s or something like that. The same faces on television, same words on television, no meaningful economic growth, definitely no growth of income by household sort of measurements in the coming years. There is no country in the world where continuous lack of improvement of economic conditions finally did not lead to political changes. No, well, let's say a relatively developed country in the world. We're not talking about some African dictatorships, which are based on a much more brutal force than Putin's regime. But one has to be, alas, patient. Well, it will take time. And it will take more sanctions. It will take more inventive attitudes to the Russian regime. It will take a significant work by the West globally to undermine Russian influence. And that is probably the next stage in the West's and Ukraine's, first and foremost of all, confrontation with Putin.
Very much for very interesting insights. Two little questions from one side. You mentioned that those economic pressures, sanctions, or the stagnation could bring about some kind of pressure for the Russian society to show some political social opposition against Putin's regime. Which groups would be most likely to show some kind of opposition or riots from the political elites or the society first? And the second thing, you nicely describe how is Ukraine as a smaller state less capable of showing military might and power against all the resources that Russia wields. And you mentioned that Putin is capable and willing, together with military leadership, in a similar way as Stalin supplied the front lines with corpses, with people, and therefore he wields this capability to wear down the Western Ukraine in its fight against this aggression. And you mentioned that decisive victory on part of Ukraine. What kind of resources would Ukraine require to achieve something so decisive and significant for Russia to understand that it cannot win this war?
Answering the first question, it's too early to say which groups may contribute to the downfall of Putin's regime. Moreover, I would like to qualify my answer. Maybe we will not see this downfall, or we will not see it the way you would usually like to envisage a fall of a dictatorship, a kind of democratic or quasi-democratic revolution. It may well be that the Russian society will remain passive for a long, long time, because I think what is not sufficiently realized in this war of assessments of whether Russians are eternal slaves or whether they are basically all very patriotic and support Putin and are ready to go to the front. I think one thing that is important to take on board is that definitely, even if the regime falls as a result of a political movement, not general chaos and disintegration of Russia, which is a separate question, it will be a very active, but I think not very large minority that will bring it down. The majority of the people in Russia actually retreated into a kind of comfort zone in which they already existed before. And by saying comfort zone, I don't mean that they live wonderful lives or that they are psychologically stable. No. Russia is a country of habitual, outside of the very big cities, in smaller places, and by the Russian standard, a small town is 200,000 people. In these places, 200,000-300,000 people, towns, one factory town sometimes, habitual poverty, habitual crime, and habitual immorality are very widely spread. That's where you recruit most of the people that go and then are being sacrificed on the Ukrainian front. Now, these people will probably not take part in anything unless there is a general breakdown of law and order and they just go and loot their neighbors. The minority that may eventually emerge, and it may emerge in years, is probably those discontent with war, those who are directly hit by war. And that means that much more many, a much larger number of body bags has to arrive in Russia than it is today. Russia is an atomized society where everyone cares just for oneself, one's immediate family, maybe a few friends. Everything else does not exist. While Ivan Petrovich, living just one floor below in your high-rise, has lost, I don't know, 2 sons, you don't care about it. It's not your business. It is a society which is highly atomized, and because of that, it doesn't put a lot of premium on morality and solidarity. So the movement will spring not from realization that this is an immoral, imperialistic, colonial war. It may, well, I don't say it will, it may spring from the realization that there are too many casualties. Secondly, I think that if there is defeat upon defeat upon defeat, and, for example, some regions have to sacrifice more men to be sent to the front, then regional leaders may emerge that will say enough is enough. The good people of Khabarovsk do not want to fight in a faraway land we know little about, to paraphrase Neville Chamberlain. So I think that this is more of a possibility than some kind of super mega democratic movement a la democratic Russia in 1989, 1990, 1991. And this is something that may lead to also unpredictable results in Russia itself. I mean, people that may not be Putin, but those who may not be particularly sympathetic to the Westerners may emerge as potential leaders. One has to remember also that if there is a wider sense of discontent and if there is a separatist element to this sort of protest or to this realization that the war is unwinnable and the regime is tired, you have to remember organized crime plays a huge role especially in Russian regions. It is a different type of crime from the 1990s. It's very frequently people in suits that were people in leather jackets in the 1990s. They are now deputies, deputy governors, famous business people, but they maintain their old networks. And in case they feel that, Putin does not satisfy them, and at the same time, the local FSB, the local secret police, is no longer strong enough to clamp down on them, they may emerge as potential leaders. Now, for your second question about what is needed for Ukraine to win, I would say that first and foremost of all, the Ukrainian army has to be not only given much vaster arsenal of modern weaponry. I think that training the Ukrainian military should be put on a completely different basis. Essentially, it should be so rotational that the Ukrainian army, parts of it will always be in training, and including, those who are being recruited, those who volunteer. They have to go straight away, not only through training, but through Western training. I think that means taking on board more risks of so-called escalation for the NATO countries. There has to be a much bigger presence of NATO advisors on Ukrainian territory or in Ukrainian western borderlands. There has to be probably more robust intelligence support. I think that military means have to be very significant. Secondly, I would say that building or creating reserve infrastructure for Ukraine, including energy infrastructure, is very important. Ukrainians have to know that any given time, no matter how many Russian shells or missiles fall on their land, they will have electricity, they will have water, things like that. So innovative technological decisions are needed here. And I also think that we haven't seen a very clear signal from the West, including, by the way, the United States, as to what is seen as permissible for the Ukrainians to do in this war. I mean, we heard some hints through the New York Times or the Washington Post. Oh, the Biden administration is not against Ukrainians hitting this and that from time to time in Belgorod Oblast or somewhere. But there is no clear political statement saying we think that any action by Ukrainian armed forces, of course, that will not involve massive civilian casualties, because that will be very, very detrimental to the Ukrainian cause. If Ukraine suddenly starts to fight the war Russia is fighting in Ukraine, that's exactly the advantage, that the Ukrainians are fighting a different war. But everything else, yeah, no problem. I think that the fact that some NATO countries, and I don't mean only those on the European continent, are still reticent to send the signal, hampers Ukrainian resolve. Yes, we understand that Putin may try to escalate. He will probably try to hit Kiev and so forth. But frankly speaking, I think it has to be left to the Ukrainians to decide, to the Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian leadership. Political context does matter. And finally, I think a very important element of the political strategy globally has to be strengthened. Russia is fighting its war because it has allies, or I would say semi-allies, like China, like India, like Iran, like several South American countries, like Brazil, today even more than yesterday under Bolsonaro. A much, much, much bigger effort, which will disregard some of the old business strategic interests there, should be undertaken to limit, decrease support by India, by China, by Brazil, by Iran towards Russia. It's very problematic, because once you start kind of getting out of the European area, lots of things immediately kind of surface, like, what about Volkswagen running its factories with slave labor in China? They will be very much against any kind of pressure. I think that demands really this thing that used to be the leitmotif of the 1990s in Russia, politicheskaya voля, political will. I think this is exactly what is needed in such circumstances, because limiting this support will hit Putin very hard. Nothing hits Putin externally more than visible loss of those he pretends are allies. And this is, I think, to use a Second World War metaphor comparison, this second front, to my mind, hasn't yet been opened in serious, in earnest. And I understand all the problems with the Biden administration and its balancing act and domestic politics and things like that. But look, everyone is saying China is the next enemy. Well, let's take the enemy on earlier. And I think that much more diplomatic, political, economic work should be undertaken. One shouldn't forget, let's say, countries like Israel that have been quite ambiguous about helping the West in its fight against Putin. Kind of prod them on, work on that.
Absolutely. One last question. We have talked a couple of what ifs. So what if the West finally gives everything Ukraine needs, the training and the good technologies and military supplies? Then what if the good forces in Germany tries to pressure China because of like the huge investments Germany has inside of Russia, Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW, for Russia to be less ambiguous about the atrocities that Russia commits in Ukraine? Then what if the good forces from St. Petersburg Oblast takes over and puts together some kind of revolution and the Putin gets replaced? And the eventual question, because we have witnessed so many evidence from the past, like Stalin was not replaced, he died in March of 1953, but the Soviet Union didn't change much. Would the regime change, adjust Russia to make it more modern, normal country, especially for its neighbors? That's my final question to you.
Actually, I think that Putin's replacement by kind of post-Stalin-like collective leadership is a possible scenario. Of course, you're not going to get Václav Havels and Lech Walesas and Nelson Mandelas in the Kremlin after that. But the difference with 1953 is very important. In 1953, the Soviet Union was not fighting a losing war. The Soviet Union was a victorious power, totalitarian, imperialistic, controlling half of Europe, but it was not engaged in a war which it was evidently incapable of winning, if not completely losing it. So the difference is important. I think that anyone who replaces Putin, if this replacement really happens from within the regime, will seriously consider continuing this war. So far, I do not believe in this idea that, oh, Putin will be replaced by a Prigozhin who will use nukes. No, I don't think so. I think it's a narrative that's being put out specifically to deter any action against Putin's regime. This typical thing, oh, well, you know, the other people are so crazy, you'd rather put up with Putin and his demands. So I think that whoever comes after will be interested in somehow ending this conflict. And then the question will be, what will be the conditions? My feeling is that any Russian regime coming after Putin, it will probably be a kind of collective leadership, a la 1955-56. I think it will be clear about what it ultimately is prepared to do. I think it will be prepared to vacate the whole of eastern and southeastern Ukraine under some pretext. Maybe asking for, I know, the OSCE contingents to be sent there to monitor the rights of Russians, quote unquote, and things like that. I think the ultimate thing for them will be the Crimea. And I think the argument will be, look, if you force us to give the Crimea back, then the dark forces of Putinism will return and you'll see the resumption of war. You don't want it. You really want a very democratic President Mishustin in the Kremlin or whoever. Probably not Lavrov. I think it will be. But the current Prime Minister Mishustin is probably quite a good candidate to present a new face. And then a lot of people in Germany, in France, in other places will say, oh, yeah, we need to support President Mishustin in his attempt to reform the dark legacy of Putin. That will be their calculation. So everything apart from the Crimea and lift the sanctions. Reparations, take everything that Mr. Usmanov, Mr. Deripaska, and the rest of them have abroad and give it to Ukrainians. But we can't pay more because, you know, if we start paying money to Ukraine, then the dark forces of Putinism, you know the narrative after that, right? So I think that this is a possibility. Again, it is for the Ukrainians to decide how far they're prepared to go to liberate their territory. And I think that for the West, it is important not to swallow a new wave of the Kremlin propaganda, and that is after Putin is replaced or dies or something happens to him, or he becomes a monk on Mount Athos. I think that it is for the West not to fall into this trap. Oh, without Khrushchev, it's a catastrophe. Oh, without Gorbachev, it is a catastrophe. Oh, without Yeltsin, it is a catastrophe. I think lots of people, even in Russia, start to understand that it should be reformed. I mean, it should cease being a presidential republic, and that under the condition that it will survive in one piece. Disintegration is a possibility if there is chaos in the Kremlin, especially if the transition is not smooth. There is a possibility for Russia to regionalize and to become a confederation or probably even a collection of states that will try to survive. How? That's a different question. But I think that it is important for the West to be prepared for different options and not to be scared by Putin's narrative of escalation, or Putin's narrative, if not me, then Prigozhin. A lot of it is scare tactics rather than reality. And I think that another thing is probably the final thing I want to say. The other thing for which the West should be prepared, even in a very successful scenario of Russia relinquishing all the territories it occupied, and that will be difficult thing, because then you have to start talking about Georgia, for example, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But even if it is successful, even if Russia is within its 25th of December 1991 borders, it will take maybe a century. If the country survives as one piece, again, that's a very important condition. If it survives in some form, it will take at least a century for it to come to some kind of senses, to start developing as a modern nation, if it ever happens. But I think the West should insist on one outcome of this war. It shouldn't ask for Russian democracy. It will not be achievable in the coming decades. But to quote James Sher, Russia should be at peace with itself and with its neighbors. If this is achieved, then maybe Ukrainian suffering was not in vain. And Ukraine, of course, should be not rewarded. It earned it already. It has to become a member of NATO and the European Union and become a very important member of the Western family of nations. If these two things coincide, Ukraine in NATO and the EU, whole, free within its 1991 borders, and Russia at peace with itself and with its neighbors, well, I will die peacefully. I will feel that, I've seen something good in my life.
Thank you very much, Konstantin, for very nice roster of ideas and the optimism. But even with this optimism, we have to face a roster of challenges stemming from the relationships with Russia. And for someone like me who is coming from the Baltic states, and we have always strongly supported the fastest possible accession of Ukraine and Georgia to NATO, I think stabilizing this region and closing the gray zone or the ghetto, that existed after the collapse of the Soviet Union is salient also for this regime. Thank you very much. I would like to thank for this conversation to Konstantin Egert, who is a well-known freelance journalist working at Deutsche Welle with all things Russian. On behalf of the Latvian Transatlantic Organization, I would like to thank you for the ideas and close this conversation for us.
Thank you.